Council, please.
Council members Manukian.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Quintero. Weaver.
Here.
Mayor Friedman.
Here.
Roll call for redevelopment agency, please.
Agency members Friedman.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Quintero. Weaver.
Here.
Chairman Manukian.
Here.
And roll call for the Housing Authority, please.
Authority members Friedman.
Here.
Manukian.
Here.
Mincy.
Here.
Najarian.
Here.
Barazian.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chairman Quintero.
We hear your report, please.
The agenda for the January 10, 2012 special joint meeting of the Glendale City Council, the Glendale Redevelopment Agency, and the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, January 5, 2012 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Thank you. Are we going to Mr. Hagani or Mr. Ochoa?
Yes, ma'am. We want to do item A, B, and C, right? And just by way of background on these items, these are all outgrowths of the recent court case that has been decided by the California Supreme Court concerning AB 1X26 and 27, as those two statutes were adopted by the California State Legislature and signed into law by Governor Brown. As you know, the two statutes indicate that, one, the redevelopment agencies were to be eliminated, and under 27, the second point was that they were to be breathed back to life in exchange for what many have termed a ransom payment. The state Supreme Court has ruled that 27 was indeed unconstitutional under the provisions of the Prop 22 initiative that was brought by the redevelopment agencies a couple of years ago. However, that 26, that the state of California did indeed retain the authority to dissolve and eliminate redevelopment agencies. As you might imagine, such a massive change on this scale has completely upset the way that we do business and serve this community, eliminate blight and crime, and create jobs and new investment opportunities. In dealing with this, there are several actions that need to be taken. And the items that are listed there on your agenda really speak to what those items are. Under 26, the redevelopment agency would be dissolved, and we are allowed to have a successor agency. So what is contemplated in the statute and what is before you here are items on item A to have the city of Glendale become the successor agency for the redevelopment agency. That is unique. My counterpart is indicating, am I going too far in advance? Okay. So I want to make sure, because we do have a presentation really for the edification of the community as well as the agency board and city council.
Mr. Mitchell?
Yes, sir.
Could I get a hard copy of these slides?
We will be presenting that to you as Mr. Lanzafame will do his presentation in just a second. But just in terms of setting the tone for the discussions, having the successor agency appointed or named, and then recognizing that that successor agency does not really retain the authority to dispose of agency assets under the dissolution of the redevelopment agencies. That would fall to an oversight committee that oversees what the successor agency does. And even that oversight committee is overseen itself by the State Department of Finance. We will get into what that means.
Who's overseeing the Department of the Finance?
Say again, sir?
Who's overseeing the Department of Finance?
That right there is the $1.8 billion question. And one
Shouldn't they have another organization overseeing the...
It would seem that the remedy for what is perceived in Sacramento as poor governance is to add still two more layers of government on top of that level that the community knows best and trusts most. Unfortunately, as it may seem, we're going through those gyrations. So that item is there before you. The second item is a resolution to have the Housing Authority retain housing assets and functions, and Mr. Lanzafame will talk about that as well. And then finally, the Housing Authority resolution electing to retain Housing Authority assets and functions is there before the Housing Authority. This is a joint hearing. All of this to mean that we are taking steps to prepare for the worst while we actively work to preserve the position of the people and businesses of Glendale. So with that, and hopefully I didn't steal too much of his thunder, Phil will give us a presentation on what to expect going forward.
Ms. Mayor, members of the City Council, Redevelopment Agency, and Housing Authority, we are here to discuss the status of AB 26. And Rita, if we can get to the next slide. If we put on the full screen. Through this presentation, we want to talk to you just a little bit, remind you in the community of what happened, talk about what it means to Glendale, some of the effects that this legislation has. Want to walk you through a case study, and then come back and talk about some strategies going forward.
So this one is different.
I've lost my presentation. F5. Next slide, please. Back in June of last year, the legislature adopted AB 1X, or X1 26 and 27. As was mentioned, 26 eliminated redevelopment agencies in the state of California. 27 allowed them to reconstitute themselves by making a large payment to the state of California to help with their budget shortfalls. Sometime over the summer of last year, the League of California Cities and the California Redevelopment Association challenged that legislation, citing it unconstitutional under several levels, or under several positions. In December of last year, the Supreme Court, who had the case initially because it did have statewide importance, rendered their opinion. They upheld the constitutionality of 26, that was to eliminate redevelopment agencies. They struck down as unconstitutional AB 27, which allowed ourselves to redevelopment agencies to reconstitute themselves. It's kind of the last action with their opinion is they pushed the timing of the legislation, all the things that were to happen, by 4 months. That was the length of time between their stay and when they had a decision.
And just to interrupt Phil very quickly, because sometimes in the course of the last several months and this discussion, this debate about AB 1X 26 and 27, folks have indicated that perhaps the redevelopment agencies are being overly dramatic in the way that this legislation was characterized, this notion of a ransom payment. And actually one of the senators was able to speak truth to power on the floor of the Senate by calling out very clearly, in 26, agencies are eliminated. In 27, agencies are brought back if they make a payment to the state of California. I don't know many other definitions for extortion or ransom, but truly that seems to fit the bill. While redevelopment certainly has its foes and its critics, in this particular case, it should be readily apparent to all that what was done with purpose of taking that money. And at the end of the day, it was about that money. Arthur.
Can we get back to where we were? Next slide, please. What does it mean? We're here today with a couple of actions that are noted here. As Mr. Ochoa said, on February 1st, redevelopment agencies in California, including the Glendale Redevelopment Agency, will cease to exist by law. They will be replaced with successor agencies. Those successor agencies have a limited purpose. That is to create what we're calling a redevelopment obligation retirement fund, pay off all your debts. That's what this body would do. To adopt certain payment schedules. We have obligations as a redevelopment agency, so we need to let the state, the county, and the state know what are those obligations. We will receive property tax from the county auditor controller through a property tax trust fund. We will give him the payment schedules. They will give us dollars to make those debt payments, the successor agencies, that is. The successor agencies are charged with expeditiously winding down any agreements that are out there. We have agreements that last the length of construction on a project to the Disney deal that could be 30 years going forward. And then finally, this is one that is very scary, is to dispose of all of the agency's assets. If we have cash in a fund balance, it needs to go to the controller. If we have property, it is supposed to be sold for the highest amount. And in fact, the law actually says to get the highest value possible. Those proceeds would then go to the county and be distributed to other taxing agencies.
We talk a great deal about the county and about the controller. What we're really, that's code for the state of California's own obligations. Again, to drive home the point, the state is taking local monies and having these local agencies provide resources for the obligations of the state of California. Something wholly and completely unprecedented.
Sometime in January, March, and then in the summertime, Glendale took several actions to try and protect the assets. We issued $50 million in bonds, taxable bonds. We repaid a portion of the city loan, some $30 million. We amended existing cooperation agreements. We entered into additional cooperation agreements to have the city take on some of the actions of the redevelopment agency so that we could finish those projects that are important to the community. We assigned receivables to the city of Glendale. There are rents that we have. There are loan payments that are coming. These are all assets of the city, of this community, that we moved to the city in an effort to try and protect those. We also moved title to many of our properties to the city of Glendale, again, as a means to preserve those assets for this community. Next slide, please. These are the agency assets that were transferred. The one at the bottom in red it was not transferred. I'll explain that when we get there. But these are the assets that we tried to protect. There are provisions in the law that would allow, or at least there's the argument that the oversight boards, and we'll talk about those, but they're made up of county and city and school representatives.
The Panda Inn doesn't belong to us. It's the lot. It's not the restaurant itself, right?
It is the lot that the restaurant is on.
The lot, not the. We don't own any restaurants.
That's what we refer to it.
Right.
Thank you very much for the clarity. Yes, it is that piece of property at 111 East Wilson that the Panda sits on. There is an argument to be made, and actually the law, there's some they would argue the law would ask us to return those assets to the successor agency and then sell those for the highest value. At the top of the list is the Alex Theater. What this would mean is that a property that was lawfully purchased by the redevelopment agency, lawfully rehabilitated, has historic standing, and is an asset to this community and really the region, would be forced to be sold to a private entity without any control other than the historic designation. It could be sold to a movie producer that could lock the doors and just use it for a movie set. That's an extreme. It could be sold to somebody that has large gatherings, like a church. The Alex Theater would then become a church and not the regional performing arts center that it was intended to be.
And just to be clear, as far as I understand it, the interior of the Alex is not protected. So if someone was to buy it, they could gut the Alex and put office space in it if they wanted.
I think you're correct. I'm not fully sure, but I believe that's the case. So they could make alterations to the inside.
But if you don't take anything else away from this slide or the previous slide, is that the stakes are incredibly high for Glendale, both in terms of financial resources and the land that exists as assets. All of that would be swept away to the benefit of the state.
The Maryland Exchange is the retail shops that we own. There's a lot at 300 East Broadway that has some overflow parking. Some of those, okay, if we were to lose a 25-space parking lot, Glendale would probably rebound. But things like the Alex Theater, the open space at the Americana, which was an agency asset that we transferred to the city, these are big-ticket items that are important to this community. And again, as Scott said, if you take nothing away, this is how dire it could be for us. The Courtyard by Marriott was a project. It's at 225 West Wilson. We've entered into a ground lease or an agreement for a ground lease with the developer to build a courtyard there. That agreement is secure. However, it's on an agency-owned piece of property. And so while we would be the benefactors, we being this community, of rent, ongoing rent, they're asking that that property be sold and then with those proceeds distributed out to other taxing entities. We will be creative and work on ways to actually build the hotel, because one of the benefits of redevelopment is that we're allowed to do those types of things. That creates TOT, transient occupancy tax, or hotel bed tax, that goes to our general fund to fund general services. So this is a project that's an example of how we turn redevelopment, eliminate blight, but also provide for the community in indirect ways. Next slide, please. That's kind of the 80% side of the commercial side of redevelopment. There is the housing functions. 20% of all of our increment is set aside for affordable housing. What does the law prescribe? The city could elect to do one of three things: retain those housing functions, they could give them to a local housing authority, or they could transfer them to the state housing and community development. In Glendale, for several years, this housing authority has been implementing the obligations of the redevelopment agency. One of the actions that we're asking for today is that you reaffirm that and say, yes, this local housing authority, the Glendale Housing Authority, will take on the obligations of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency. You are able to, as the housing authority, receive all of its assets. The way the law is currently written, that excludes fund balance. We believe there's somewhere in the neighborhood of $6.5 million in cash that would be going to build new housing, to buy existing stock, or to rehabilitate existing stock. That is not part of what you, as the housing authority, would receive. But you will have all of the functions, all of the rights, obligations, and privileges of the housing authority. The current balance, that cash balance that I just referenced, would go to, again, the county auditor controller to then be dispersed to the taxing agencies. There is legislation in front of that is being introduced right now. It went through committee today to change that, which would allow the housing authorities to retain those fund balances and continue to do housing activities until those are all exhausted. And then that would be the end of the housing program.
And so while we are asking you to take affirmative steps in the form of these resolutions this afternoon, again, we are looking to fight tooth and nail to intercept all of the efforts of the state of California, but still we need to be prepared for that worst case, and hence the resolutions before you this afternoon.
If we can have the next slide.
Did you say in your last statement that the housing authority was, the way you said it sounded like it was, the housing authority was going away?
Well, once all of the assets and funds are extinguished, you won't get any new money, but once that happens, 2 or 3 projects later, then yes, there would be no more assets to implement, and so there would be no further need for the housing authority in Glendale. And there would be no affordable housing program. That is new development, rehabilitation, first-time home buyers, rental assistance programs. We would not have the funding, at least I should say, through set-aside to carry those out. We would still have some amount of federal funds. The Oversight Board, we'd mentioned this. The successor agency is responsible for unwinding and selling assets and carrying on the business of the redevelopment agency. They have, though, an overseer, and that is a board that is made up of 7 people. All of the actions of the successor agency, that would be you, are reviewable by the Oversight Board, and they could say, no, we don't agree with that. Even as we mentioned before and kind of teased in the beginning, the Department of Finance and the State Controller can oversee the Oversight Board. So there are several layers up the ladder on this. That Oversight Board of 7 people There is no provision. In fact, it says there will be no compensation. And the costs of that board and implementing that board are borne by the successor agency. The makeup is a very interesting makeup. 7 members, 2 of which are appointed by the County Board of Supervisors. One is an appointment, a general appointment. Could be anybody, could be somebody on their staff. The other is a person from the public. The mayor of Glendale would have 2 selections. One could, again, be a general selection, anybody that you want. We would have some suggestions on that. But one of them must be an employee from the redevelopment agency, one of the recognized bargaining units. And this was the state legislature's nod to say, we understand that employee groups are going to be affected by this, so we'll put one of them on the oversight board.
And as insulting as that is in a way, to say here is some consolation prize for actually having a position eliminated or positions eliminated, what I think the takeaway from this particular slide is that the 5 members of the City Council stand for election every 4 years. You have folks who will vote for you or not, but they have the opportunity based on your performance. As you look here at the dissolution of the Glendale Redevelopment Agency, there are folks who are not necessarily elected officials, not necessarily Glendale residents, who will have a say in unwinding, who presumably would have a say in the unwinding of all of the assets of this agency. That seems to me completely wrong-headed and completely unaccountable to the voters of this community.
What the other makeup is other taxing agencies, County Superintendent of Education to represent schools, the Chancellor of Community Colleges to represent community colleges, and then the largest tax district. Now, we do know that for instance, we would like to ask the Chancellor of Community Colleges to appoint the President of Glendale Community College. At least then you have somebody with an interest in the City of Glendale sitting on this oversight board, along with presumably the elections of the mayor.
But understanding that even if that were to work out, if we got the chancellor, if we got interests on the oversight board that were sensitive to the interests of Glendale, if those decisions by the oversight board were inconsistent with that which the State Department of Finance feels is appropriate, those decisions get undone as well.
Next slide, please, Rita. There is an administrative budget that we have to come up with. We do it every 6 months now. Some of the terms here, redevelopment property tax trust fund, all the increment and other revenues, that's rents, land sale proceeds, goes into this account that is overseen by the auditor controller, the county auditor controller. The successor agency would be preparing what's called a recognized obligation payment schedule, the ROPS. That would dictate what our approved enforceable obligations are for which we could ask funding to make those payments. There is a percentage of the increment, or I should say the property tax, that is available for administration because there will be some need for somebody to oversee and do the day-to-day work of unwinding. In the first year, that's 5% of the amount of money that we would include on our ROPS. We believe that's somewhere around $21 million, $22 million for most of our it's bond debt service and the city loan. And again, Scott had mentioned it earlier, for your staff, the city loan right now is paramount. That is the most important thing to protect. 3% going forward, and then they do put a floor on that. In no case is it less than $250,000. Now, they prescribe these for you for your staffing, but an oversight board or the State Department of Finance can say, no, that's too much, and cut that to something else. The balance is distributed to other taxing entities. Glendale is a taxing entity. Citywide, we collect about 13.5% of every tax dollar comes back to Glendale. In the redevelopment project areas, it's a different tax rate. It's a little over 17, about 17.5% that we collect. Next slide, Rita. What does the auditor controller do? they will need to come in, and county by county, this is going to happen. All 400 redevelopment agencies will need to be audited, and all of their assets and fund balances will need to be confirmed. They will determine, had a redevelopment project continued, what amount of tax increment would you have gotten, and they deposit that in the property tax trust fund. We are then able to ask for our payments for our debt service. The pass-throughs to other taxing entities that we currently have, the school district and the county, those take priority. And then we get our budget, our administrative costs, and then the rest gets distributed out. Rita? Here's some of the effects on Glendale and our redevelopment program. These combined add to about $25 million. Probably first and the biggest impact will be to our central library. I know that it was built in late 60s, early 70s. We did some rehabilitation in the early 90s, but it really hasn't had a major makeover since it was constructed. We were looking to reposition the library, make some necessary improvements with some bond funds. We were unable to use those at this time. So that project, if there is no new legislation, that project would go by the wayside. The Alex Theater, we talked earlier about the potential for it to be sold. This redevelopment agency was reviewing and considering an expansion that would keep the theater competitive with other theaters in the area. That expansion project may, at least part of that funding, may be lost. The Museum of Neon Art is a project that you have approved. While that agreement is in place and we have obligations to do that, it is part and parcel with the Paseo project and the construction of the parking lot behind that. We've got that there as Paseo and Parking Lot 10. That is in jeopardy. And so if you can't build one, you may not want to build or need to build the other. Fire Station 26 and Casa Verdugo Library, these were structural improvements that the redevelopment agency was going to fund. We will have to find other resources in the general fund. Those can be found and done, but that means there's $375,000 that can't be put somewhere else. The Community Development Building, this was the remodel of the old police building to house the 5 divisions of community development and start to give the organization the necessary space to conduct the service to the community. This would have included our building, our permit center, and all of our neighborhood services functions. Central Avenue improvements is a rebuilding of Central Avenue. It is deteriorated, much as Brand Boulevard. A few years back, we reconstructed that. 2 private projects. Lemley Lofts we have an agreement. This redevelopment agency asked that underground parking be included and some funding to go along with that. That additional funding is at risk with this program. And then Courtyard by Marriott, small tweaks that they wanted to make. We think that there's a way to work around those, but it will be something different than what we originally approved.
But all of this infuses tremendous uncertainty into what it is that we are trying to do for our own local economy. And we know what that impact of the uncertainty is that it pulls back interest and willingness of investors, builders, developers, and anyone else in the community to want to spend those dollars. So as long as this is looming over the heads of redevelopment agencies like Glendale's, what you'll continue to see is this lingering and very stubborn jobless recovery taking root. The legislature will hopefully, and we'll talk about in a second, will hopefully see a way clear to undo that which has been done.
These are a number of housing programs that would be affected. They run the gamut from new development to what we called Life Wrap, was an educational and rental assistance program. Vet Wrap, which was veterans and reassimilating. Virtually every one of our housing programs would be affected. Rehabilitation grants and the like. Rita? The effects on the organization, there are 55, we've estimated 55 positions that are funded by redevelopment. That is throughout the organization. There are people in building and safety that work on redevelopment projects. There are people in planning that work on redevelopment projects. There are people in legal. There are finance. It's virtually throughout the organization where these effects are. But really, the important part is the effect on the community. Probably first and foremost are those affordable housing programs. We had something in the neighborhood of, I had in my notes, 350 first-time home buyers that we've assisted in the last 15 years. We wouldn't have those types of things. There are several, almost 1,000 rehab grants. The loss of amenities, from public improvements to public infrastructure, public facilities, goods and services from the private sector, those would be lost. The financial resources, we talked about the city loan. We generate revenue from some of our projects that would be forfeited to the successor agency and then the county and the state. Probably an important bullet that may have gone to the top is crime and blight abatement. I think the chief of police has several times made the statement, it's far easier to police, say, the Americana brand today than it was in 2003 when it was a vacant lot. That can't be overstated, I should say. And then service reductions. At some point, we're down to a bare minimum. At some point, there is going to be service reductions that we will have to face and figure a creative way to come up with those or do without. On our economy, the California Redevelopment Association had done a survey in 2003. At that time, they had estimated 304,000 jobs statewide were tied to redevelopment. And that's not the 55 jobs that we listed at the top. That goes from architects and engineers from the start of a project through to construction and those people that hold permanent jobs afterwards. And then economic catalysts. We've really seen this in Glendale where a robust redevelopment program has brought private investment. You've approved several projects at the tail end of last year that's representative of that. Next slide. We wanted to do a quick case study on the Lemley Lofts project. This was 42 units in a 5-screen theater. We looked at 2 potential scenarios. One, what would this look like before AB 26? What does it look like after, where we were forced to sell the asset? So next slide, please. This is a matrix of some of the benefits. You'll see Glendale, this is about 1.32. This is through the end of our redevelopment project area in 2025. The city at the same time collects about $66,000 on a pass-through. The school, $75,000. County of LA, $202. Those are all pass-throughs that we're obligated to make. In terms of fees of this project...
And Phil, I'm sorry to interrupt, and poor Phil, this is my first presentation with him. And we kind of go back and forth and jump on these. I just want to make sure it's very clear, because sometimes we use terminology and jargon that doesn't make sense necessarily to folks out in the community that are watching this. We talk about pass-throughs. Oftentimes, the criticism on redevelopment is that it's siphoning money away from other taxing agencies like school districts, like community colleges, like the County of Los Angeles. What we wanted to show here is that absolutely they are the pass-throughs that are there. We're passing through monies from the redevelopment agency to those other agencies. And that if we're able to grow the pie much bigger for everybody, everyone is benefiting from this.
In terms of fees, there's about... $700,000, and we say to Glendale. Now, we can see what they are, but it includes the school district. They will receive fees on the development of this project. That 150 construction jobs and 40 full-time jobs, again, is a benefit to Glendale. We're showing it under the community, but it's also a benefit to anybody that through the schools or lives in this county. Sales tax is what it is, and then we've listed some of the intangible benefits: elimination of blight, a new arts venue for people in town, something to leverage with the Alex Theater.
And we'll have to amend this slide just in one way. The sales tax benefit that comes back to the state of California, while we have sales tax benefits, the 1% that comes back to point of sale, not accounting for the triple flip that the state did last time with their voodoo budgeting. But we do have that point of sale return. Well, the state of California gets the largest share of the state sales tax. Now, the Glendale Redevelopment Agency is making an investment and taking on risk to put this project out on the street to generate these revenues. State of California is not venturing anything, yet when that sales tax starts to flow and flow in perpetuity, they are realizing that benefit. I think we need to make sure
That is an excellent point, and just an error on our part when we put it together. It's probably 600,000 or 700,000. So I think they get 6 or 7% of that sales tax. So under the state of California, in that cell, you would put $600,000 or $700,000. Next slide, please. This is what happens with the law as it stands today. We valued that piece of property, just the one that's owned by the agency where the Panda Inn sits, at approximately $1.7 million. If that property is sold, we lose $1.4 million, Glendale does, and then the city gets back $302,000 of that $1.7 million. The county takes the lion's share of that. We plugged in a zero for the school district because while they would take some of that $343,000, what it's actually doing is relieving the state of having to backfill their Prop 98 guarantee. So it's no new money to the school district, but it is to the state. And we've got a slide to explain that.
The prior slide, you have approximately $200,000 for the school district and the county of LA. Are they annual amounts, or is it a one-time?
That is through the expiration of the project area.
So it's an annual amount, where this slide that you have up here in scenario number 2.
That's one time.
That is a one-time, and
Right.
it's sold and it's gone. It doesn't generate anything else.
It would continue to generate property tax that would get split, but there's no net new.
Okay.
This recap, this takes the last two slides and shows them side by side, just as you mentioned, Mr. Manukian, and shows you the dollars. Clearly, Glendale loses a huge benefit. The school district doesn't make anything more on this than they would have. The county does, although we'd like to do a study to see what would the county get if you did continue on with the project. Next slide, please. We're bouncing back and forth between some of these. Go back one, please. So why did we do this? Why did the state do this? Two things have been called out: to fund local services, mainly for police and fire, and then to fund our local schools. This is something that we want to do for the locals. But really what's happened is the state has pushed services that were state obligations. They pushed them down to the county, and now they're saying you're going to get some additional property tax to take on these additional services. Again, I would ask the police chief what his experience is, but many in the county are concerned that what is getting paid to them and the responsibility that they're given don't match up. With the schools, we talked a little bit about being a zero-sum proposition. If you can go to the next slide, Rita. The schools are guaranteed under Proposition 98 a certain level of funding, and that is paid predominantly through property tax. And what you see in that left-hand column is that property tax. We all own our homes, we pay a tax. A portion of that goes to the state, or it goes back to schools. Then there's some tax sharing that we send to the school district because of our redevelopment program. And whatever's left, the state has to pay out of their general fund to backfill that guarantee. On post-AB 26, what's happening is you still have property tax, but that tax increment that was coming to the redevelopment agencies is going into the trust fund, and it's being distributed out to schools and counties.
Why is the property tax in post-AB 26 less than pre-AB 26? Because post-AB 26 you have redevelopment and the property values are higher. You would assume that
Actually, they should be, and I was going to note that. They should be the same. when we were putting this is for illustrative purposes. It should be the same. You're absolutely right. But that shadowed, that cross-hatched area, that is an amount we're saying that comes to the school districts that was formerly tax increment, and all it does is it relieves the state's backfill. It doesn't increase that amount above Prop 98. And our school district, and I just was with Joylene Wagner, one of the board members this morning, they understand that. They understand that this program does not give them any new money. It doesn't give them any more money with which to conduct educational programs.
So the schools are still going to be funded to Prop 98 levels, whether this happens or not.
That's right.
They lose the redevelopment
And-
pass-throughs. They lose money.
And now what the legislature has done is they've, with a wave of a wand, they've said land sale proceeds, rents, whatever you're collecting, in addition to property tax, it's now all property tax. So schools, you don't get to claim that as something else. That's all property tax, and it relieves the state. That's why in the slide before, we put a 0 for the school district, and we really showed the benefit to the state.
And what's interesting about this, with the pass-through monies that go from local governments like cities to school districts generally, or at least through contractual terms with their counterpart city, have discretion over how to spend that money. If you are washing money effectively through the state of California, it's going to come back down to you with strings attached. And that's one of the things I think you'll see with the state of California. Increasingly, what you have seen over the last 25 to 30 years is an increased desire to push a governance structure from Sacramento and control the purse strings that allow them to have that control over how we conduct business. Cities are really the last bastion of local control. Counties are political extensions of the state. School districts under Prop 13 and Prop 98 are wholly dependent upon the state for funding. Cities are not. Cities have historically been independent. And what you're seeing now in the context of this debate is the ongoing erosion of that control. It's a very scary time for cities.
And Rita, next slide. We put this graph together to show before AB 26, the Glendale community was really the focus of your redevelopment program. The Redevelopment and Housing Authority served this community according to their wants, their needs as represented to you. And then you made that policy decision, we made it happen. What happens in a post-AB 26 structure is now the state of California is really the focus. And everybody from the successor agencies through the county, they are all serving that state purpose. This goes right along with what Scott was talking about. We've shown Glendale down at the bottom there. They're disconnected from the decision-making process. This community no longer has any influence on what happens with those redevelopment dollars. They're all going back to the state to solve statewide budget problems rather than staying local where we need those services and those improvements that we have been doing for the last 30 or 40 years. The next slide, I'll turn it over to Scott Ochoa.
And we'll close out at this point and answer any questions, or try our best to answer any questions that the council and the agency and authority might have. But that question comes up as to what now? Okay, you've painted this very scary, bad picture. What do we do? What can we do about it? And unfortunately, with this all coming together in really just a matter of the last 10 days, details are sparse. But that doesn't mean that we can't anticipate and make and craft strategies to move the organization forward. So what we are looking at really is a three-pronged approach. A legislative solution that you see there, SB 659, was the bill number that was assigned to a bill that may be, we are told, may be sponsored by local Senator Alex Padilla. That would basically buy a little bit of time, give a stay of execution, as it were, to those redevelopment agencies. The indication as of this afternoon is that the senator may hold back on that pending what is going on other fronts on this particular debate in the legislature. As you might expect, things are very, very fluid. As you see up on the screen, you have election year dynamics. It is no secret that we have representatives who are running for election in open primaries and sometimes newly redrawn districts. There is a desire to show local governments and communities that they support what it is that we're trying to achieve. So we are hopeful that we can combine the dynamics of those elections that are coming in the fall with an opportunity to seek some kind of compromise. And that is a very salient point for us, that as we move forward in this discussion, there is no alternative being proffered, no alternative to redevelopment being proffered by anybody at the state of California. It wasn't as though they gave us a choice of saying, hey, we can do this or we can do that. They just said, the phrase was, they needed to end it to mend it. And when you ask them about, okay, what would you put in its place, it being redevelopment, no one really had any idea. That's more than a little bit worrisome if you look at the success that a place like Glendale's had and you look at the dysfunctionality of the state. So legislatively, we are reaching out to seek out the best thinking and wisdom of our state representatives. Litigation, well, we need to take all measures to preserve our standing. Glendale has taken some protective measures in the year leading up to this particular set of circumstances, and so we are looking to preserve the city loan, to preserve the assets that were moved from the agency over to the city. And if need be, we will seek some kind of injunctive relief based on the as-applied impacts of AB 1X26. At the same time, as I've shared with the council, we do have that solemn responsibility to prepare for the worst. And not just on an organizational basis. When I say organizational strategy, as you see on the screen, it's looking at what happens to those positions that are affected overall in the CD, in the Community Development Department and through the organization, but also what happens to the community. When you think of the positions that are funded by redevelopment, neighborhood services, all of our customer service within the building and planning and development counters, all of those things will feel an impact, which means that our community will feel an impact. Still, identifying what those primary and secondary impacts are will be our obligation. We'll be bringing that back to you in the coming weeks, hopefully not months, because this has to come together much sooner than not, as Phil had indicated. But we will prepare several different alternatives for the council, for the community to consider. In a best-case scenario, the state would realize the damage that's being caused and pull back on the reins, come up with a compromise solution that gets them what they want. They want the money. At the end of the day, this was about $1.8 billion for the state's general fund. Many cities had signed on to do that, and Glendale being one. We had actually approved a continuation ordinance that said, leave us alone, we'll pay the money, and we'll move forward from there. Unfortunately, that was not meant to be. This feels a great deal like the book Guns of August. If you know that book, 1914, what happens in Europe, a chain of events that ultimately unleash World War I. At this point, after where we've been with the state of California, after where we've been with the recession, it just seems that our message collectively as cities to Sacramento should be, don't help us so much. Let us stand on our own. We've been weathering the storm. To that end, when people ask, what can I do, because we do hope for a legislative solution, we would ask that you contact your legislative representatives, Senator Liu, Assemblyman Gatto, and Assemblyman Portantino, who Mr. Portantino quite famously had stood up. He was one of the few people on his side of the aisle to resist this push to eliminate redevelopment, and at first initially paid dearly for it. But he emerged with his head up, as it seems. So we do want you to contact these folks, and the council will be setting meetings individually with some of these legislators as well. We wanted to make sure that we have this study session early in the year because, again, all this is happening very quickly. We do have actions for you in the form of the resolutions that we need to take in order to preserve our standing should that worst-case scenario come to pass. But at this point, we would invite any questions that the council might have.
Questions? What was the vote on XI 26 in the Assembly?
It went down party lines, save one member.
Party lines? Weren't the Republicans were voting to keep redevelopment?
They were, yes. and voting against. The partisan dynamics, I think, were very evident in what the vote was. I mean, quite candidly, it seemed as though the governor was pushing it, the Republicans voted against it.
Okay, I thought it was pretty much a bipartisan, because there were many conservatives who felt that smaller government is better, and that there were some abuses by some of the local agencies and municipalities that they highlighted. The problem that I see it is the situation that gave rise to the creation of AB X126 hasn't changed. In fact, it's gotten worse. I think the state budget situation is worse. We heard just earlier in the year that there are going to be other deeper cuts proposed to some of the health and human services, welfare, child care, health care. I'm afraid that our legislators are not going to, when it comes down to permitting us to retain some of our tax increment at the expense of them finding other places to cut again, that they're going to say, you know what, it is an election year, and my constituency, whether you want to call it entitlements or other sort of programs to assist the poor and needy and children and education, that they weigh a lot more heavily in their analysis than the municipalities. So as everything that we said, I mean, it's a great cause of action and we're geared up, but I was very negative on this from the very beginning. I hold absolutely no hope for our elected officials to make any change. I think the marching orders are going to come from John Perez in the Assembly and Darrell Steinberg in the Senate, and it's going to be another fait accompli as to what we're doing here. I encourage trying to keep our options open, but I'm very skeptical that there's anything we can do that's going to save this to any great extent. They may throw us something just to chew on and try and appease us, but I just think it's a sad situation, and we should be thinking really way outside the box on ways that we can handle this. And I think it goes far beyond sending Mike Gatto and Carol Liu a letter, because we were on them very heavily when we first got wind of this thing, and they actually gave us absolutely no respect or no consideration in what we were telling them. So I don't see any change in that regard. That's just my thoughts on the subject. I hope I'm wrong. I hope there is a future for redevelopment, but I really think we're in the doomsday scenario here.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. Seeing
We have
none.
resolutions.
Mr. Ochoa.
Some motions?
If I can just to one point, because I hear what Mr. Najarian is saying, and I see it in Technicolor because of where we've been. If there is any light at the end of the tunnel that is not a train coming our way, I think it is the idea, the notion. As you talk to many of these legislators, they didn't intend for this to happen. What they wanted was money. They wanted $1.8 billion. And many of the agencies were willing to give it. Some were not. And even as you talk to the California Redevelopment Association, they're quick to point out that, well, there's anywhere from 10 to 30% of the redevelopment agencies in the state could not make the payment under under whatever the bill was at that point, that ransom payment. At some point, I would hope that before that they would embark on what is going to be a very drawn-out, litigious process to eliminate the redevelopment agencies, if there is a shorter path between the 2 points to get the money, which is what this was always about, that maybe they would meet us halfway, because if not, then you may well be right that this is a foregone conclusion in the mind of many state legislators. But I think it's important that for the council that we look under every stone. But as you quite clearly indicate, be prepared for the worst.
Okay, with that, we have a council resolution.
Move 1A and B for the council.
Second?
Okay, roll call.
Council members Menuchyan.
Yes.
Najarian.
Yes.
Weaver.
Aye.
Mayor Friedman.
Yes.
Move 1C for the housing.
Second.
Roll call, please, for 1C.
Authority members Friedman. Menuchyan.
Yes.
Mency.
Yes.
Parazian.
Yes.
Weaver.
Aye.
Vice Chairman Najarian.
Yes. Move to adjourn for council.
Second.
Council's adjourned.
Move to join for the redevelopment.
Redevelopment.
Move to adjourn for housing.
Second.
Housing is adjourned.
Stay tuned for the redevelopment agency meeting.